Jasmine Crockett faced Bill O'Reilly in a live congressional hearing and revealed the $32 million he had secretly paid to silence a former colleague. As she read each line of the settlement aloud, the entire room fell silent. One question pierced everything. How many women walked into your office and didn't walk out whole? O'Reilly was speechless. In less than 5 minutes, the empire he had spent 30 years building collapsed live on national television. But what left all of America stunned was what she said next. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It started with a leak, not gossip, not speculation, but a 42-page internal Fox News dossier labeled Confidential, Internal Use Only. It appeared on a whistleblower site at 3:14 a.m. Eastern. By sunrise, the whole country knew. Bill O'Reilly, once the most powerful voice in conservative media, had personally approved 6 secret settlements totaling over $45 million. The largest, $32 million, was paid to Liz Wheel, a legal analyst who had been a regular on his show, often introduced with a smile and the line, "A brilliant mind and a beautiful package." The leak hit the media like an explosion. Talk shows immediately reacted with outrage. Social media erupted with hashtags like #No More NDAs and O'Reilly Files. But the real shock wasn't just the money, it was the proof. O'Reilly's signature on every agreement and internal emails, in his own words, contain exposure, minimize disruption, critical asset protection. Fox News gave only one brief response. We are reviewing these documents. But by then, it was too late. The documents were verified, and the pressure on Congress to respond became impossible to ignore. For the first time in U.S. history, Congress called a public hearing, not just to investigate one man, but to expose how an entire media empire shielded him. This wasn't a private review or closed-door session. It was a full oversight committee hearing, broadcast live under oath, meant to answer one question. How many women were silenced so one man could stay on the air? The hearing wasn't sparked by a lawsuit. It was the scale, the money, the secrecy, the years of protection. Leading the questioning was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a former civil rights attorney known for representing the unheard. She didn't chase headlines. She built cases. She didn't argue on Twitter. She filed motions. And now she'd face the man who once shaped national opinion until the truth reshaped him. 2 days before the hearing, Bill O'Reilly broke his silence with a late-night podcast. The lighting was harsh, his face close to the camera. No studio polish. I didn't do anything wrong, he said, his voice low and tight. I wasn't convicted. I was targeted. This isn't justice. It's politics. An attack by radicals who hate free speech. His hands never appeared. His tone never wavered. But the message landed flat. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. Analysts dissected his blinking, his posture, his phrasing, but one line echoed louder than anything else. This is politics. Not quite a denial, not quite a defense, just desperation. And this time, it wasn't enough. But this time, the old playbook didn't land. This is politics had always worked, to deflect, divide, delay. But now it sounded tired. The country wasn't tuning in to hear excuses. It was watching to see if a man built on fear could survive when the fear turned back on him. And when the hearing room doors opened the next morning, 2 very different histories walked into the light. O'Reilly entered first. Cameras fired in bursts as he walked slowly, stiffly, eyes straight ahead. He wore a pale blue tie and a suit that looked too carefully chosen. His jaw clenched. His hands stayed at his sides. No nods, no smiles. Just a man trying to look taller than the weight on his back. He paused at the witness table long enough for one last photo. The fallen giant still pretending he wasn't. Then Jasmine Crockett appeared. No spotlight, no flash, just presence. A navy blue suit, white blouse, folder in hand. She didn't look around, didn't wave. She moved like someone who didn't come to perform, but to finish what others were too afraid to start. She didn't look at O'Reilly. She didn't need to. Her pace said enough. Steady, precise, surgical. When the gavel struck, O'Reilly leaned into the mic. I'm a victim of cancel culture, he said, voice low, rehearsed. Crockett looked up. expression unreadable. Then came her answer. Calm, cutting. You're not a victim of cancel culture. You're a product of silence culture. His lips curled into a faint smirk, but his eyes faltered. And in that moment, the room felt it. He was smiling not out of confidence, but out of fear. The room was silent, not the kind of silence that waits, but the kind that knows something irreversible is coming. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't even raise her hand. She simply reached into the manila folder she had kept closed for the last 20 minutes and pulled out one document. She placed it flat on the table in front of her, smoothed its corners with a single motion, and then slid it across to the clerk without a word. Within seconds, it appeared on the monitors above. The title was plain, clinical, Settlement Agreement between Liz Wheel and Bill O'Reilly. But the text below it was anything but routine. There it was in black and white, line after line of tightly written clauses, each one designed not to protect truth, but to bury it. The amount, $32 million. The terms, absolute silence. Liz Wheel, a former Fox News analyst and legal contributor, had agreed never to speak publicly about what happened. Never to speak to the press, never to file further legal action, never to even admit that this agreement existed. In exchange, she was paid more money than most Americans would see in 5 lifetimes. And at the bottom, beneath the block paragraphs of legal insulation, sat Bill O'Reilly's signature, bold, unmistakable, and final. Jasmine let the room sit in that reality. She didn't speak right away. She let everyone read it for themselves. Let them see how much silence costs when the one buying it has a national platform and the one selling it has no choice. Then calmly and clearly, she broke the silence. $32 million, she said. Not for a trial, not after a conviction, just to ensure one woman would never speak again. Her eyes scanned the committee, then landed squarely on O'Reilly. This isn't a settlement, it's a muzzle. She leaned slightly forward, the tone in her voice sharpening. Not louder, just more precise. No one pays $32 million if they're innocent. They pay to disappear the truth. The silence that followed wasn't still, it was boiling. The weight of Crockett's words hovered in the air like smoke after a detonation, and for the first time, the cameras didn't look at her. They turned to him. O'Reilly shifted in his chair, stiff at first, then sharper, like a man fighting his own spine. He cleared his throat once, then leaned in toward the microphone. His voice came out low, slower than usual, each word pushed through clenched teeth. I don't admit wrongdoing, he said. This was a legal solution, a decision made to protect my family, from headlines, from false claims, from damage that can't be undone. His jaw tightened. People think money equals guilt. It doesn't. It equals survival. He paused, blinking rapidly, just once. I've been in this business long enough to know what happens when a lie spreads. You either bury it or it buries you. His tone was meant to sound resolute, but something frayed around the edges, something unspoken that cracked beneath the final word. Across the room, Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. But the moment was shifting. O'Reilly wasn't just defending himself. He was unraveling in real time, arguing not with the room, but with a truth that had already outrun him. But survival, as the next moment made clear, wasn't something O'Reilly could script anymore. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't shift in her seat or give any dramatic prelude. She simply tapped a key on the touch panel in front of her, and the room dimmed as the screen behind her lit up. A timestamp flashed. June 14th, 2013. Studio B, Fox News HQ. The footage was raw and unpolished, clearly taken from a behind-the-scenes surveillance feed. No music, no angles, just a fixed frame and a truth no one had meant for the public to see. O'Reilly stood off-center in the shot, adjusting his tie between takes. A young female technician entered from the right, quietly approaching the camera rig. What followed wasn't a burst of rage. It was something colder, more calculated. His voice cut through the silence, sharp and entitled. If you're going to walk into my line of sight, at least pretend you belong here, he said, not looking at her. The woman froze mid-step. He turned slightly, sneering. Do you want to be on camera, sweetheart? Or do you want to keep your job? She gave a short nod, barely audible, then turned and walked out of frame. There was no shouting, no physical contact, but every syllable was loaded with dominance. The tape ended, the lights returned, and so did the silence. It wasn't a smoking gun in a courtroom sense, but it was devastating in the one place O'Reilly had once controlled absolutely: optics. He had made a career out of polished delivery, controlled narrative, and absolute authority in front of a camera. But this wasn't his camera. This was the version of him that didn't know he was being watched. And that, Jasmine knew, was the only version that mattered now. She didn't raise her voice. Her tone didn't change. But the quiet command in her voice pulled everyone forward in their seats. "You used to host a segment called the No Spin Zone," she said evenly, "where facts mattered, where posturing had no place." She paused just long enough to let the memory settle over the room like dust on a forgotten name. "But today, Mr. O'Reilly," she continued, her eyes locked onto his, "there is nowhere left to spin." Across the table, he said nothing. He didn't even look at her. His jaw flexed once, then again. A man once known for owning the room now couldn't meet the eyes of the woman dismantling him piece by piece. The audience didn't applaud. This wasn't that kind of theater. But even in silence, something had shifted. What they had just seen wasn't about politics. It wasn't about left or right. It was about the tone a powerful man used when no one he respected was listening. And in that moment, the nation saw it for what it was. Not just arrogance, but expectation. An expectation of obedience, invisibility, and consequence-free cruelty. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't even blink, because she knew this was only the beginning. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was personal. Not the kind that waits for someone to speak, but the kind that forces them to. Everyone in the room had just watched the same footage. Everyone had heard the words. They were not shouted. They were not disguised. They were quiet, cutting, calculated. The kind of words that don't leave bruises but leave damage. O'Reilly, once the man who spoke over guests, over critics, over entire segments, was now sitting in a room where no one was interrupting him. And the weight of that was visible on his face. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and too loud against the stillness. His fingers tightened around the microphone, knuckles pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tight, like he was forcing it past something lodged deep in his chest. "It was a joke," he said. "We joked around. That was the nature of the studio." He paused, then added, almost mechanically, "There was no complaint." None filed. But he didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at the committee. He didn't look at the monitors still frozen on the technician's face. Instead, he stared down at the desk in front of him, as if the truth might disappear if he avoided its reflection. His words were carefully chosen, legally safe, emotionally hollow. He tried to make them sound normal, like a rational explanation in a world that had gone irrational. But they didn't sound like truth. They sounded like damage control, like something rehearsed. And maybe once that might have worked. Maybe 5 years ago, or even 5 days ago, the benefit of the doubt would have been enough. But not here, not today, not after the silence of the woman on the screen said more than any lawsuit ever could. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The room had already done it for her. The shift wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, and devastating. It was in the way staffers stopped taking notes, in how some of the committee members lowered their eyes, in how even the court reporters paused for a breath they didn't realize they were holding. What had just been heard was not a defense. It was the sound of a man grasping for a world that no longer existed, and watching, in real time, as it slipped away. And just when it seemed the room might breathe again, Jasmine Crockett took it to the one place O'Reilly could no longer reach. Someone else's voice. She tapped her microphone once, calmly, then said, "The committee will now hear sworn testimony from Witness 7. The monitors shifted. A new feed appeared, dimly lit, featureless. The figure on screen was blurred entirely. Voice modulation gave her a mechanical tone, but nothing could disguise the quiet control behind each word. "I was 26, the witness began. I had just been promoted to junior producer on a segment Mr. O'Reilly hosted. It was supposed to be a step forward in my career." Her voice never cracked. It didn't need to. The story did that on its own. One afternoon, I was reviewing notes outside the green room. He called me in. The door closed behind me. There was a pause, not for effect, but because some memories still asked for permission. He asked if I wanted to keep moving up, told me I was smart for someone who didn't come from money. Then he stepped between me and the door and smiled. The room was completely still. Even the court reporters had stopped typing. The voice continued. I got out. I told my supervisor, and 4 days later, I was called into legal. Her tone flattened. They told me Fox had a process for situations like mine, that I would be compensated for the confusion. I was handed a document, already printed, $5 million, a non-disclosure agreement. If I signed, I kept my reputation. If I didn't, they couldn't guarantee anything. Another beat of silence. I signed because I was scared, because I thought survival meant silence. The screen faded to black. Crockett didn't move for a moment. She let the silence breathe. She looked across the room, not at O'Reilly, but at the committee, at the press, at the public watching from living rooms and phones and courtrooms across the country. Then she leaned slightly toward her microphone and said, they didn't just pay for silence. They built a system to enforce it. But today, that system is breaking. Today, I bought time. Not to speak over her, but to let her finally be heard. There was no reaction from O'Reilly. None. He didn't reach for the mic. He didn't shift in his chair. He just stared, unmoving, unblinking, at the half-empty water glass in front of him. The condensation had formed a slow, trembling ring on the wood. His eyes never left it, as if looking up would mean accepting that the world he had once ruled no longer recognized him as its voice. No rebuttal, no anger, just stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from discipline, but from knowing there's nothing left to say. Because what had just happened wasn't theater. It was exposure. And this time, he wasn't the one holding the camera. The room hadn't moved since the last witness disappeared from the screen. But Jasmine Crockett was already preparing her next incision. She didn't need to explain that silence had been bought. Now she was going to prove how many times it had been, down to the cent. She retrieved the final document from her folder and handed it to the clerk. This one wasn't dramatic in appearance, just a spreadsheet, no logos, no cover page. But as it flashed onto the monitors, the shift in the room was immediate. It wasn't the format that stunned them. It was the content. Across the screen, a long list of internal financial transactions originating from a legal account marked Holden and Bright L, LP, Reserve Trust C. Line after line, each entry a quiet confession. Payments of $750,000, $1.25 million, $400,000. Each one labeled with clinical precision. Intern locker room, post-incident agreement. Production coordinator, Studio B complaint, NDA extension, subject, on-air comment. There were no names, just roles, titles, and timestamps, all carefully recorded, all matched to allegations that, until now, had never seen daylight. Crockett stood silent for a few seconds, letting the screen speak for itself. She didn't raise her voice or drive the point with a lecture. She just let the numbers breathe. Let them show what the polished PR statements never had. This wasn't damage control. It was a system, a mechanism designed to absorb scandal, neutralize victims, and preserve reputations, quietly, efficiently, and with precision. The kind of system that doesn't exist by accident. The kind that requires approval, sign-off, and someone with enough power to authorize payout after payout without question. She didn't name O'Reilly in that moment. She didn't have to. His role in the architecture was already written between every line of every transaction. The silence that followed was different than before. This wasn't stunned disbelief. It was cold understanding. No one coughed. No one looked down to take notes. They didn't need to. The truth wasn't speculative anymore. It was procedural, boring even in how routine it had become. And that, in many ways, was the most horrifying part. Jasmine's voice finally returned, calm but resolute. This isn't just a pattern, she said. It's a ledger of silence. Every dollar a warning, every line a threat. Not because they were afraid of lies, but because they were terrified of the truth. The numbers had done what no accusation could. They collapsed the illusion. For several long seconds, the room remained frozen in that reality. Then, without warning, Bill O'Reilly broke the stillness. He leaned forward with a sudden, sharp movement, his voice louder now, sharper, more brittle. "This isn't justice," he snapped. "This is theater." His fingers gripped the edge of the table, and for the first time in the hearing, the practiced restraint cracked. "You don't care about the truth, Congresswoman. You care about the optics. You care about headlines. You want your viral moment, and you're using me to get it." His voice didn't shake, but his eyes did. It wasn't the fury of a man who knew he was innocent. It was the rage of someone who'd lost control of the narrative. "You think you're some kind of savior?" he continued. "I built careers. I gave people platforms, including Lee Stott." He let the name hang in the air like it was his final card. "And now she sends a letter? Hiding behind paper and lawyers? I don't get to defend myself against that, do I?" But Jasmine Crockett didn't respond. She didn't meet the volume with volume. She simply opened a single envelope that had been resting untouched beside her notes. The paper inside was soft, folded once down the middle. No legal header, no formal statement, just handwriting, elegant, deliberate, and unforgiving. She unfolded the page with the care of someone holding something sacred. Then she read aloud. "I don't need an apology," the letter said. Crockett's voice didn't rise, but it rang clear in every corner of the chamber. "I need someone who will make sure this never happens to another woman again. No anger, no accusation, just the kind of truth that leaves no room to run." She folded the letter in silence and placed it gently back on the table, next to the documents that had torn through layers of denial. And still, she didn't look at O'Reilly, because she wasn't speaking to him anymore. She was speaking to the space he once occupied, the one he used to control. The room had changed. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't about ideology now. It wasn't about parties or press cycles or even scandal. It was about reckoning. And in that silence, deep, cold, final, O'Reilly muttered something under his breath, barely audible to the microphones. But it was enough. "I helped her," he said, not to anyone in particular. His voice was hoarse now, eyes glassy. "I helped her, and now she's using me to build her career?" He wasn't asking. He was unraveling. The bravado was gone. What was left wasn't anger. It was disbelief. The quiet kind that sets in when a man who built his empire on control finally realizes it's gone. That no clip, no contract, no audience could shield him from what had already landed. The cameras didn't zoom in. They didn't have to. The image of him sitting there, small, hunched, fingers curled around a half-empty glass of water, was already burned into the moment. There was no standing ovation, no dramatic gavel, just the steady breath of history being made without permission. And Crockett? She didn't nod. She didn't speak. She just watched. Not as a woman seeking victory, but as someone who had been on the other side of silence and chose today to be the one who broke it. The air in the room had grown heavy, not from noise, but from the weight of what had already been said, already shown, already proven. The pages had spoken. The video had spoken. The voices of the unnamed had filled the chamber with a truth so sharp it cut through years of silence in seconds. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She had taken this hearing step by step, not for spectacle, not for politics, but to build something that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be spun, and couldn't be forgotten. Now she stood at the edge of the final question, the one no chart or contract could answer. Her hand rested on the table, steady as ever. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her tone didn't rise. And yet, when she spoke, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. "How many women," she asked, each word clear, deliberate, and low, "walked into your office and didn't walk out whole?" The question didn't hang in the air. It landed, full weight, full force, without needing volume or emphasis. No one spoke. No one coughed. Even the click of a camera shutter, constant earlier in the hearing, was suddenly gone. All eyes were on O'Reilly. But it wasn't the attention he had once thrived on. This wasn't admiration. It was expectation. The kind that doesn't ask for entertainment. It demands truth. O'Reilly didn't respond at first. His hands remained folded on the table, but the grip had tightened. His knuckles were pale, almost trembling, though he tried to keep them still. His chest rose with a slow breath, calculated, practiced, but the mask was slipping. He looked up, but not at Crockett, not at anyone. His eyes found the space between the nameplate and the microphone, and stayed there, fixed, distant, trapped. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but then closed again. The seconds passed, and with each one, the silence deepened. Not empty, but thick with everything he chose not to say. It wasn't just that he didn't answer the question, it was that he couldn't. Not without pulling loose every brick in the wall he'd built around himself for decades. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper, not to the committee, not to Jasmine, but almost to himself. "They want my career dead," he said, and the words came out cracked, uneven. His voice, once powerful enough to command prime time, now barely reached the microphone. "They want everything I built to collapse." He didn't look angry, not anymore. He looked displaced, like a man standing in the ashes of something he had never imagined would burn. Across from him, Crockett remained still. She didn't blink. She didn't reach for notes or the mic. Her silence didn't feel passive. It felt earned. It felt like control reclaimed. She let his words sit in the space for a moment, let them echo in a room that had already heard too many excuses. Then she leaned forward just slightly, not aggressive, not performative, just enough to make sure every syllable that followed would land. "No," she said, her voice calm, but unshakably firm. "They don't want your career to die, Mr. O'Reilly. They want something far more human. They want you to remember." He didn't look up. His jaw flexed, but his body remained still. "They want you to remember what it felt like to be alone in a room with someone who had power over them. To remember the words that weren't jokes, the doors that didn't stay open, the choices they were forced to make just to get out, and the silence they were forced to live with after." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the weight of testimony that had never made it into court. It carried the names of women who weren't on the screen, weren't in the news, but whose fingerprints were on every document, every line of that spreadsheet, every footstep that brought this hearing into existence. "They want you to remember," she continued, "because the world didn't, because the system didn't, and because for years, decades, you were allowed to forget." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of grief, of all the things that had been too expensive to say until now. No one moved, no one dared, because they weren't just witnessing the unraveling of a man. They were witnessing the confrontation of an entire era, the era of immunity, of unchecked power wrapped in charm and contracts and airtime. And in this moment, it had finally met the one thing it had never prepared for: accountability with a name and a voice. O'Reilly's eyes were red now, not from tears exactly, but from the effort it took to hold them back. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched slightly forward, like the weight of the question was pressing down on his spine. Still, he didn't reply. He didn't argue. He didn't reach for a lawyer's note or a planned rebuttal, because no script in the world had ever prepared him for this part. The part where the women who had once been edited out of the frame were now writing the final lines. Jasmine sat back slightly, hands folded again in front of her. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her strength wasn't in winning. It was in witnessing, in standing firm, in refusing to let this man, or any man like him, walk away without being made to see what he had left behind. And the room, though filled with people, felt completely still, as if time itself had paused to absorb what had just passed between them. Not just a question, not just an answer, but the echo of every moment someone chose silence over truth and someone else profited from it. And now, for the first time, it was O'Reilly who had nothing left to say. The silence O'Reilly left behind didn't last. It didn't fade quietly into the next headline or die in the bottom scroll of cable news. It ignited. Within hours, the footage from the hearing had been clipped, captioned, and uploaded to every major platform. But it wasn't just the speech or the evidence that spread. It was the still frame. Jasmine Crockett seated calmly, staring across the table, and O'Reilly slumped forward, his eyes dark, mouth parted but silent. That single image rocketed across social media like a final verdict. Cold, unarguable, and viral. Hashtags exploded. No more silence. Crockett hear me? No spin left? Within 24 hours, the hearing video had amassed over 87 million views across YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. Influencers posted breakdowns, attorneys live-streamed analysis, celebrities tweeted quotes from Jasmine as if they were scripture, and survivors, thousands of them, began speaking. Some anonymously, some directly, some for the first time in years. But this time, something was different. The world didn't look away. By the second day, the story had evolved beyond a public reckoning. It was becoming a legal one. Late that evening, the Office of the New York State Attorney General released a brief but seismic statement. In light of new evidence presented during the Oversight Committee hearing, it read, "We are opening a formal criminal investigation into potential violations of state labor, harassment, and obstruction laws involving multiple former executives and associates of Fox News." The language was careful, but it didn't need to be dramatic. The meaning was clear. The state of New York was no longer waiting for Washington. It was moving. At the same time, a less visible but equally important legal battle began to erupt. Lawyers representing several of the women previously silenced by non-disclosure agreements filed emergency motions in civil court to unseal those contracts. In the filings, they cited public interest, precedent, and a credible pattern of coercion and abuse protected by confidential settlements. And one after another, judges started to listen. By day 5, 3 NDAs had been suspended pending judicial review. By day 10, 2 women had been granted temporary clearance to speak publicly without penalty. And then came the headline no one had expected. A sitting federal judge in the Southern District of New York ruled that, in cases where contracts serve to conceal systemic abuse rather than resolve it, the First Amendment cannot be held hostage by corporate silence. The ruling was immediate, binding, and irreversible. Suddenly, the system O'Reilly and others had relied on for years, the paper fortress of hush money and legal clauses, was cracking. And behind it, voices were pouring out. In Brooklyn, a former segment coordinator held a press conference with her attorney. "I signed that NDA when I was 23, she said, voice shaking but firm. "I thought it was the only way to make it stop. Now I know silence was never my protection. It was his." In Chicago, a former makeup artist wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, detailing the quiet humiliation she'd endured in studio dressing rooms and the 2-sentence agreement she was once pressured to sign. In Dallas, a former assistant producer went viral reading her NDA on TikTok, then tearing it in half on camera. Each story carried the same weight. Each story turned the spotlight back on the same figure. And still, Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't chase interviews. She didn't tweet victory laps. Instead, she released a single statement from her office. Justice should never depend on volume, wealth, or spotlight. It should depend on truth. We were never here to destroy a man. We were here to stop a machine. That machine, once powered by denial, backed by dollars and guarded by contracts, was now under federal scrutiny. Investigators began issuing subpoenas. Journalists began naming not just O'Reilly, but the legal teams, the corporate liaisons, the executives who had signed off on every payout without ever questioning why they were needed. Pressure mounted on the Department of Justice to step in. Advocacy groups launched national campaigns demanding reform of how NDAs could be used in harassment cases. Editorial boards across the country called for broader inquiries, not just into Fox News, but into media networks, publishing houses, political institutions. The question had shifted from what did he do to how many others got away with it. And still, O'Reilly said nothing. He hadn't been seen publicly since the hearing. His podcast, once aired weekly without fail, went dark. Scheduled speaking engagements were quietly canceled. His last book deal was suspended by the publisher pending further developments. In a rare and brief statement, his legal team said he was reviewing his options. But there were fewer options now, because this time, the damage wasn't reputation, it was legal. And the walls that once protected him weren't just cracking, they were collapsing. For Jasmine Crockett, the spotlight never seemed to change her posture. She continued her work in Congress, attending committee meetings, introducing bills aimed at transparency in corporate settlements, and granting precisely one interview to a local public radio station in her district. When asked what moment from the hearing stayed with her the most, she didn't mention the letter. She didn't mention the spreadsheet. She didn't even mention the final exchange. Instead, she said calmly, "It was the silence in the room, when the truth no longer needed to be shouted. It just stood there, and no one could move past it." And across America, that silence was still rippling. In boardrooms, in newsrooms, in courtrooms where judges were now rereading contracts they had once rubber-stamped without pause. It wasn't just that people were listening. It was that, for the first time, those in power were being forced to. Because when a system is built to bury voices, the real revolution isn't in how loud you shout. It's in what happens when the silence finally breaks and the truth refuses to go back underground. And when the system finally cracked open, the voices that had been buried the longest rose first. It began quietly, just a single name. A former production assistant who, days after the NDA ruling was overturned, posted a photo of herself on social media. No words, just her name, the date she signed the agreement, and the caption, "I am no longer afraid." Within an hour, it was shared 40,000 times. Within a day, 4 more women followed. They came from different departments, different cities, even different decades, but their stories formed the same arc. Isolation, power imbalance, forced silence. Each post peeled back a layer of the facade, showing the personal cost behind every corporate denial. They didn't speak like victims. They spoke like people reclaiming ownership of what had been taken from them. Dignity, memory, voice. By the end of the week, more than 30 women had come forward, and they weren't just telling their stories to reporters. They were testifying, writing, organizing. One launched a nonprofit dedicated to helping others escape NDA entrapment. Another appeared on national television, reading excerpts from the original contract she had once been told to burn. A third, a former intern, stood outside the very Fox News building where she once ran scripts across floors, holding a sign that read, "He remembered none of us. We never forgot him." The stories weren't all dramatic. Many were subtle, moments that hadn't seemed worth reporting at the time. A hand on the lower back that lingered too long, a comment whispered behind a teleprompter, a threat made in the pause between meetings. But taken together, they revealed something undeniable. This wasn't a scandal. It was a system. And now, for the first time, that system was being named by the women it once buried. And at the center of this rising wave was Jasmine Crockett. She never called herself the center. In every interview she gave, she redirected credit to the survivors. In every headline, she insisted the moment wasn't hers, but the country's. And yet, the world saw her differently. She had not just asked the hard questions. She had held the silence. She had looked power in the eye and refused to blink. She had taken what was meant to be a performance and turned it into a reckoning. And the world noticed. 2 weeks after the hearing, Crockett was invited to speak before the United Nations in Geneva at a special session on freedom from institutional silence. She didn't accept immediately. Her office reportedly requested the focus remain on survivors, not her. But the UN made its position clear. In a global landscape where silence is often written into law, her ability to unearth truth without spectacle, without cruelty, without retreat, was precisely what the world needed to see. When she arrived at the UN headquarters, the air was crisp, the sky gray over the glass-paneled Palais des Nations. Delegates from over 70 countries were in attendance. Survivors from multiple nations sat in the gallery. Journalists from Uganda, activists from India, union leaders from Brazil. When she walked to the podium, she didn't wear designer. She didn't carry a prepared speech with sweeping rhetoric. She brought one page, typed in 14-point font, no seal, no logo, just her voice. "I did not come to silence a man," she said. "I came to end the silence that let him exist unchecked." She spoke for only 9 minutes. She quoted no political figures. She cited no polling. She spoke instead of the intern who never reported what happened in a hallway, the producer who didn't sign the NDA but still carried the shame, the women who still hadn't spoken and maybe never would. but who, for the first time, had seen their pain mirrored back without being mocked, dismissed, or forgotten. She closed with a sentence that would be translated into 36 languages by the end of the week. Silence was never a symptom, it was the strategy, and truth is the only cure brave enough to break it. When she stepped down from the podium, the room did not erupt in applause. It stood, slowly, quietly, one by one, not for spectacle, but for recognition. Later that evening, under quiet candlelight during a private ceremony attended by international human rights leaders, Jasmine Crockett was presented with the UN Human Dignity Award for the protection of voice and silence, a title that hadn't existed until that moment. The citation read simply, "For holding space when the world had forgotten how to listen." But Crockett, when she stepped up to accept, did not take credit. "This belongs to the women who spoke," she said, looking across the sea of faces, some tearful, some defiant, all changed. "And to those who still cannot. My name was not the first one erased. It will not be the last. But while I have breath, I will never let silence be mistaken for peace again." The next morning, the front pages of papers across the world carried variations of the same image. Jasmine Crockett, standing with her head bowed slightly, not triumphant, but grounded. She wasn't there to claim victory. She was there to hold the line. Back in the US, her office was flooded with letters. Not all of them supportive. Some were vicious, others were heartbroken. But the most powerful came from a woman in rural Kansas. Handwritten, no return address. It read, "I watched you stand without raising your voice. I watched him shrink without you needing to shout. I watched the world finally listen. I'm not ready to tell my story yet, but I wanted you to know I'm still here, and now I believe I matter." Thank you. Crockett never shared the letter publicly. She didn't post it, didn't quote it in any future speech, but she framed it quietly and placed it on the shelf behind her desk, next to the Constitution, next to a framed photo of her first legal mentor, next to the folded UN program from Geneva. Because this fight had never been about fame. It had never been about destroying one man's career or elevating her own. It had always been about a single radical idea, that those who have been silenced the longest are the ones the world must finally be brave enough to hear. And now, thanks to her, they were. But Crockett knew that standing on the world stage meant nothing if the laws back home still protected silence more than people. The applause in Geneva had faded. The headlines had cycled. The hearing room had emptied. But injustice, real, systemic injustice, wasn't undone by truth alone. It needed structure. It needed laws. It needed mechanisms that couldn't be ignored or rewritten in closed-door settlements. Because as long as legal agreements could be weaponized to erase pain, the architecture of abuse would remain intact, no matter how many hearings were held. Jasmine knew it, and she wasn't going to let this be just a moment. It had to be a turning point. So she went back to Washington and did what few expected her to do. She opened a new front, not on the airwaves, not on the Senate floor, but in the ink of legislative texts. A new bill, aggressive, unapologetic, written not to calm the system, but to challenge it. It was called the Federal Media Accountability and Victim Protection Act, and it was unlike anything that had ever reached committee in modern congressional history. The language was surgical, no legal vagueness, no corporate loopholes. It required full transparency for any monetary settlement involving sexual harassment, discrimination, or abuse inside publicly licensed media institutions. It banned NDAs from being used to suppress claims of sexual misconduct or retaliation. And most controversially, it made retroactive disclosure possible if a judge determined a prior agreement was used to conceal systemic harm. Survivors could come forward. Corporations would be exposed. Truth would be disentangled from the contracts that once strangled it. Crockett introduced it with no fanfare. No press conference, no campaign video. Just a packet, 84 pages, delivered directly to the speaker's desk, with her name etched quietly on the final page. But the reaction was immediate. Within hours, the media exploded. Not just the progressive outlets, but even the ones who had once protected the very mechanisms the bill sought to dismantle. Editorial boards called it a tectonic shift in media ethics. Conservative pundits called it a direct assault on corporate confidentiality. Survivors called it something else entirely. Hope. Still, the resistance was fierce. Within days, major networks and syndicates began lobbying hard behind the scenes. Executives called committee chairs. Legal counsels drafted opposition memos. Trade organizations warned of a chilling effect on internal investigations. Crockett received letters from newsroom lawyers, from retired anchors, from board members. Some urged her to narrow the scope. Others accused her of betrayal. But the sharpest letter came unsigned, delivered in an unmarked envelope, typed in all caps. "You don't get to destroy us and walk away clean." She didn't flinch. She'd seen worse. At the first reading of the bill before the House Subcommittee on Legal Reform, the room was standing room only, not because of who was present, but because of who wasn't silenced anymore. Behind the press rows, survivors sat shoulder to shoulder, former assistants, editors, junior producers. One woman sat alone in the back, holding her original NDA in a clear plastic binder, highlighted in yellow and annotated in red. "This is what my silence cost." Crockett stood and began, not with legalese, but with memory. "I have seen what silence does when it's purchased. I have seen what it means when institutions value image over humanity. I am tired of systems that call victims liabilities and predators assets. This bill does not punish truth, it protects it. And if that makes the powerful uncomfortable, then we are finally doing something right." Her words were clipped, precise, not emotional in tone, but devastating in clarity. When she cited the spreadsheet from the hearing, the one filled with 7-figure payouts and chilling labels like Stage 3 NDAs, do not review, the chamber fell into a stunned, breathless stillness. The next speaker, a former network compliance attorney, tried to downplay the bill as overbroad and emotionally driven. He called it a legislative overcorrection. Jasmine said nothing as he spoke. But when he finished, she asked one question: "How many settlements did you personally approve without asking what actually happened?" He couldn't answer. The subcommittee vote was narrow, 10-8, but the bill advanced. It was sent to full judiciary review, where the real battle began. The days that followed were ruthless. Lobbyists launched full-scale campaigns. Ads ran on primetime TV accusing the bill of weaponizing trauma. One cable host called it Crockett's Cancel Culture Manifesto. But Jasmine didn't take the bait. She kept working. Quietly, relentlessly. She met with survivor advocates. She spoke to attorneys who had once enforced the very NDAs she now sought to dismantle. She listened, not just to outrage, but to fear. Fear from staffers who worried they'd never be hired again if their names became public. Fear from men who had once enabled abuse and now wondered if their silence would be enough to convict them in the court of history. And slowly, momentum shifted. Law professors endorsed the bill. Former DOJ officials offered pro bono counsel. Civil rights groups marched outside the Capitol, holding signs that read, "The truth isn't confidential." Even a few anchors, well-known, respected, and quietly sidelined for years, spoke out on late-night interviews. "If this law had existed when I came forward," one said, "I might still have a career. But more importantly, I might have kept my name." By the time the bill reached the House floor, it had gained co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle. Some backed it out of conviction, others out of public pressure. But it didn't matter. The tide had turned, and when the vote came, the chamber held its breath. The final count, 228 to 202. It passed. There was no applause. Not right away. The moment was too dense, too earned. Jasmine sat at her desk in the chamber, fingers interlaced, eyes closed. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just exhaled. Outside, reporters shouted questions. Microphones waited. But Crockett said only this: "Power wrote the rules. We just rewrote the consequences." And that night, when the bill's passage hit the news cycle, something extraordinary happened. The silence didn't return. It stayed broken. And now, for the first time in American media history, silence no longer belonged to the highest bidder. It belonged to the people who survived it, and to the woman who refused to let the system forget them again. But when power is finally made accountable, it doesn't fall in a single moment. It unravels, Contract by contract, deal by deal, name by name. The ink on the Federal Media Accountability and Victim Protection Act was still drying when the ripple began. Quiet at first, subtle, a phone call canceled, a segment cut, a PR statement delayed, but it moved quickly, like smoke finding every open hallway in a sealed building. And at the center of it all sat Bill O'Reilly, no longer a titan, no longer a brand, no longer the man who once commanded millions of viewers nightly with a raised brow and a sharpened pause. Now he was a liability, a weight, a name executives didn't want to explain at press junkets or investment meetings. One by one, the scaffolding he'd built around himself began to collapse. The first to go was his podcast syndication deal. It had been one of the last holdouts, an audio platform with a broad conservative base that had hosted his weekly show for years, standing by him through controversy after controversy. But not this time. 3 days after the bill passed, the company quietly removed all archived episodes from their homepage. No statement, no apology, just a blank space where his name used to be. Listeners searching for the O'Reilly update were met with a 404 error and a single-line redirect. This content is no longer available. The silence wasn't just technological, it was cultural. O'Reilly had once defined what it meant to dominate a media cycle. Now he couldn't even find a host. By the end of the week, the publishing industry followed suit. His most recent book, a political memoir slated for fall release, was canceled by his longtime publisher. The contract was terminated under a previously dormant clause citing reputational harm exceeding public tolerance thresholds. It wasn't just the new book. It was all of them. Every title in print, every digital edition. Within 72 hours, Amazon delisted his author profile. Major retailers pulled his books from online shelves. Physical copies disappeared from bestseller displays. Libraries and schools received quiet instructions to reevaluate holdings. He wasn't banned. He was erased, systematically, efficiently, as if his words had never filled shelves, topped charts, or shaped minds. And still, it didn't stop. Sponsors began backing away from his name like it was radioactive. Insurance firms, political forums, college speaking circuits, each had once used his image to draw in donors, crowds, viewers. Now contracts were nullified overnight. His legal team sent cease and desist threats. Some platforms responded. Most didn't, because the real message had already been delivered, not through lawsuits or interviews, but through the cultural algorithm itself. He was no longer safe to sell. Inside his private office, the calls slowed, then stopped. The assistants left. The inbox went quiet. The hallway that once buzzed with producers, interns, publicists, it stood empty. The blinds were closed now, not for privacy, for shame. He was still free, legally. No one had dragged him from his home. No one had frozen his accounts. But he was no longer welcome. Not in the industry he built. Not in the ecosystem he had once fed. And what made it worse, what made it unbearable, wasn't the backlash. It was the silence. The same kind of silence he had once used against others. The kind that doesn't argue, doesn't shout, doesn't defend. It just removes you, leaves you staring at the door you once slammed on someone else. The final blow came not from a headline, but from a software update. One morning, he opened the podcast app on his phone, the same one he used to check his ratings, track his growth, feel connected. It updated automatically. When it reopened, his show tile was gone. Not grayed out, not locked. Gone. Replaced by a new feature box titled, Voices Worth Hearing. Front and center was a familiar face, Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't a personal attack. It was an algorithmic verdict. And that's when it hit him. Not as a scandal, not as a lawsuit, but as a fact. He had become irrelevant. This wasn't cancellation, it was exodus. The world wasn't throwing stones, it was moving on. Across the country, in homes and schools and offices, people spoke his name with past tense verbs. He once had a show. Didn't he get taken down by? There was no more fear, no more weight, just fading memory. A figure being dissolved in public consciousness, not by rage, but by irrelevance. And still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing about him directly. She was working, drafting companion legislation, meeting with international human rights monitors, preparing testimony on corporate ethics. She didn't mention O'Reilly, not once, because for her, this had never been about bringing down a man. It was about breaking the mold that let men like him flourish unchecked. That mold was shattered now, and the industry that had once defended him was busy distancing itself, not out of guilt, but out of self-preservation. In interviews, journalists tried to draw her into the fire. Do you feel vindicated? Was this personal? What would you say to him now? She never gave them what they wanted. What she said instead was this: power doesn't always scream when it's dying. Sometimes it just disappears, because the truth finally outlived the lie. And it had. O'Reilly wasn't in hiding. He still lived in his New Jersey estate, still took morning walks alone, still ordered the same takeout from the same restaurant where no one asked for autographs anymore. But the empire was gone. The studios, the publishers, the revenue streams, the invitations, the illusion. One morning he turned on the television. Not cable, just network. And there on a Sunday morning roundtable sat a panel of voices, diverse, articulate, fiery. Women, men, journalists, professors. They were debating media ethics, sharing survivor stories, quoting law. One of them mentioned the Accountability Act and praised the courage it took to pass it. No one said his name, not once. That, he realized, was the true erasure. Not censorship, irrelevance. He turned off the TV, closed the curtains, sat at his desk. The silence, once his greatest weapon, was now his only companion. And for the first time in his career, he finally understood what it felt like to be unheard. But sometimes the most powerful endings don't come with applause. They come with the kind of silence that means the room has changed, and no one dares pretend otherwise. The vote had passed. The hearings were over. The cameras had packed up. The legal memos were already being drafted by a dozen federal offices. The press pool had moved on to its next target, its next flame. But the building itself, the halls of Congress, still echoing with the voices that had once tried to drown her out, remained exactly as she remembered: polished floors, overhead fluorescents too white, and marble columns that had watched generations of battles before this one. And now Jasmine Crockett was alone. Not alone in fear, alone in purpose. The kind of aloneness that only comes after a war is won not with weapons, but with truth. Her heels struck the floor with soft, even rhythm as she stepped out from the chamber and into the east hallway of the Capitol. The air felt colder out here, not because of temperature, but because the adrenaline had finally left her body. The weight of the testimony, the stories, the stares, everything that had tried to shake her, had finally released its grip. She had spoken calmly. She had held the line. She had watched one of the most powerful voices in media fall silent, not because she shouted, but because she refused to. The lights above buzzed faintly. She walked with no phone in her hand, no aide at her side, just the echo of her own footsteps and the thrum of history still vibrating in her chest. And then she heard a voice, small, not afraid, but tentative, like someone testing whether they were allowed to ask what had been sitting in their chest for hours. "Congresswoman Crockett?" Jasmine turned. A young woman, barely 20 maybe, stood against the far wall. A Hill intern. Hair pulled back, notepad clutched to her chest like a shield. Her ID badge twisted on its lanyard. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this hallway, not without clearance. But she was here anyway, because something had compelled her to follow. Because something she had just witnessed had changed her understanding of what power looked like and who could wield it. She took one careful step forward and asked, almost in a whisper, "How do you stay calm in front of men like that?" The question didn't come from awe. It came from necessity. It came from someone who knew what it was to swallow anger, to force a smile, to pretend smaller so others didn't feel threatened. It came from someone who saw herself not in Crockett's title, but in her silence, controlled, deliberate, and unbreakable. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked at the girl, really looked. She saw the tension in her jaw, the way her shoes didn't quite fit, the way her breath caught halfway between hope and fear. It wasn't just a question. It was a lifeline, thrown across a gulf of power and time. And Jasmine knew exactly what it cost to ask it. She took one slow step toward the intern, then another. And finally, she stood directly in front of her, not towering, not posturing, just present, grounded. She said gently but clearly, "I don't stay calm." The girl blinked. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but it carried, steady, unshaken. "I stand still so they can't see the storm. But make no mistake, there's always a storm." She let the words settle. Let them do what no headline or clip could do. Then she added more quietly, "The calm isn't real, the control is. And I don't hold it for them. I hold it for every woman who never got the chance to ask that question." The intern's eyes widened, just slightly. There was no hero worship in her face, just recognition. Jasmine placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder, not for comfort, but for connection. And in that touch was a lineage, the passing of something stronger than advice, stronger than courage, legacy. Jasmine took one breath, then pulled back. "They want us loud so they can call us angry," she said. "They want us silent so they can say we had nothing to say. So I give them neither. I give them stillness they can't shake. And when they try to push me out, I make them look me in the eye." Behind her, the doors to the chamber creaked shut. The moment was over. The headlines would shift. The country would forget pieces. But this would last. The intern didn't speak. She just nodded. Not in obedience, in understanding. And Jasmine Crockett turned once more, walking toward the end of the hallway, where the afternoon light had begun to cut through the stained glass. It painted the floor in fractured color, red, gold, violet. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning no one could now deny. And somewhere behind her, barely loud enough to hear, the young woman whispered, "Not for the record, not for the news, but for herself. Because I didn't come here to argue. I came here to end it." And Jasmine, without turning back, smiled. Not wide, not for show. Just enough to say, "You've understood everything." Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.